Hello and welcome to City Breaks Valletta, Episode 7. Yosemite, Marion Jones. I'm Marion Jones, and this episode is called Days Out from Valletta. English only from now on in, no more attempts at Maltese, at least not until we get right to the end of the episode. This then is a little collection of inspirational ideas for things you might want to do to see a bit more of the island of Malta than just Valletta, even though the series so far has focused on that city. Malta is not huge, Valletta is certainly not huge, but it does have a disproportionately large bus station from where you can travel really all over the island and at pretty cheap prices too. So today I'm going to recount a couple of the trips which I actually did. I'm going to talk about possibilities for others, both bus trips and boat trips, all of which I've got penciled in for some time when I make it back to Malta. If you do a little research and read your guidebooks before you go, I think there are 2 day trips which will really stand out, things that you'll most want to do. And that would be taking a very easy to find boat trip just across the Grand Harbour to the peninsula you can see from Valletta, the 3 cities. And secondly, a bus trip, unless you've hired a car of course, a little west to Mdina and Rabat. So I'm going to work through those first. The 3 cities then, known as Birgu, Isla and Balma, although confusingly they've all got 2 names. Birgu, for example, which I'm going to focus on here because that's the one I actually visited, is also known as Vittoriosa. So the peninsula that you're looking at has 3 fingers sticking out, each with a city on them, but Birgu is the most popular one to visit, not least because the regular boat trips land there, and also I think because it's probably the one with the most to see. I'm sure those 2 facts are linked. When you stand in the upper Baraka Gardens and look out over the Grand Harbour, that lovely view that you can see is looking over towards the 3 cities. So past the harbour full of boats, across to that picturesque array of buildings you can see, a mix of forts and Baroque buildings and church domes. To get over there, all you need to do is take the lift down from Baraka Gardens, 5 minutes walk or so, and you'll arrive at the point which the ferries leave from. They're pretty regular, so you can just turn up, and the trip itself will only take a few minutes. So, Birgu then, first settled by the Knights in the 16th century, round about 1530. So they arrived, they liked what they saw, decided to settle, and pretty much straight away began building fortifications, not least the Fort St. Angelo. And a good thing too, because that played a very important role in the Great Siege. And so delighted were the Knights when they'd seen off the Ottomans that they promptly renamed the city of Birgu Vittoriosa, hence the fact that it's got 2 names, both of which are still used today. Vittoriosa, of course, means the victorious city. Not long after the siege, they decided that Malta was going to be the place they stayed, and they decided they would relocate and build their new capital, Valletta, just across the harbour. So over the next few decades, they centred themselves in Valletta, the Grand Harbour, as we call it today, being their main harbour, and Birgu / Vittoriosa gradually became a little less important. But that being the city's history, there is still plenty to see when you go to visit. It's extremely picturesque, so you're definitely going to want to just do a little wandering round the narrow streets, quite twisty, cobblestoned, lots of Maltese things to look out for, the coloured doors, the balconies, the wrought iron railings. I saw Maltese crosses carved into some of the houses. I noticed street names that were very picturesque, for example, Tric il Vant San Juan, which I worked out eventually meant St. John's Street, named of course after the Order of the Knights of St. John. Because this is where the Knights originally settled, there's still evidence today of some of those very fine buildings they left behind them, some auberges, so the big houses they built for each order to live in, for example, a road called Tric il Maestral. There are 3 city gates, so the original entrances to the city, built by the Knights. If you follow the signs to the Malta at War Museum, mentioned in a previous episode, and very possibly one of the things you do want to see in Birgu, that will take you through one of the gates. And quite a sight it is too. It's not the original gate, the one built by the Knights in the 16th century. This one, it's called the Advanced Gate, dates from 1722, which you will see, in fact, in Roman numerals across the very picturesque archway. MDCCXX11. There are 2 other gates as well, the port gate, which leads through the courtyard and up some stairs to the ramparts, and the main gate. So I would definitely recommend a bit of a wander, perhaps a visit to the Malta at War Museum, if you liked the sound of that in episode 4. It's all about daily life on the island during World War II. Absolutely fascinating, both in terms of the items collected there to look at and all the information on display, but also because underneath it there is an underground network of tunnels and rooms which were used by civilians during the war as a place to shelter, sometimes for weeks on end. And entry to the museum allows you to go down there and have a good look round. Aside from that, though, there are 2 other places to visit which I would highly recommend. One is the Inquisitor's Palace, built as soon as the knights arrived, around about 1530. I think originally it was just one of their palaces to live in, but when they relocated to Valletta 40 years later, they left this building and it became known as the Inquisitor's Palace because it was home to a religious order, but it was also the base from which inquisitions were organised, so the rooting out of people who did not hold the Catholic faith of the knights, or perhaps practice it in different ways of which they didn't approve. And so there is a very dark history attached to this building. So there were 60 or 70 clerics based there who taught prayers, helped the poor and did other Christian things, but there was the scary side. And the exhibitions inside there today allow you to look round and learn quite a lot more about all of this. For example, I came across the stated aim of the knights, justifying what later became known as the Inquisition. It was, they said, to, quote, communicate the truth, fight ignorance and heresy in order to convert the ordinary folk to the church doctrine. Evangelism, you could say, but actually the reality here, Inquisition, meant that if you were seen not to do as they wished, not to agree with their view of things, then punishment would follow, and that could include prison, torture, and even execution. In the exhibition, lots of stories are told about some of the people they persecuted. For example, from 1658, 2 Quaker missionaries, Sarah Cheevers and Catherine Evans, who were arrested for preaching Protestantism and were not discharged until 4 years later. There are display boards with lots of details of the crimes. I've got that in inverted commas, because they were crimes in the eyes of the knights, perhaps the rest of us would call it, following your own beliefs. So, things you could be charged for included owning or even being caught reading one of the prohibited books, of which there were many, things they did not approve of, having any heretical opinion, as they called it, possibly meaning an opinion different from theirs, blasphemy, bigamy, and a whole category of so-called crimes known as using superstitious remedies or magical activities. Punishments could be relatively mild, for example, being made to regret your misdeeds, as they put it. Perhaps in public you'd be asked to kneel in full view of an audience with your hands on the gospel and make a vow of repentance. But for those who persisted in declaring their innocence or holding the views that the knights objected to, then torture might follow, and in some cases execution. I saw a spot outside marked by a plaque which was the exact location of the public executions carried out there. There was information too about public book burnings. So very much the idea of the knights as thought police, telling you what you could and couldn't think, what you could and couldn't read. It's a splendid palace to look round. You see lots of the rooms pretty much as they were in the 16th century. You certainly learn a lot, but it is really quite a gruesome visit if you really think about some of the things which were going on at that time. The other place in Birgu which I really think you shouldn't miss is St. Lawrence's Church, built by the knights pretty much as soon as they arrived, so starting in 1530, and intended at the time to be their conventual church, their central church, the main one. This, of course, until they decided to relocate to Valletta and build St. John's Cathedral. In fact, St. Lawrence's Church, as it is today, is not the original. This one was built in 1681. It's the Church of St. Lawrence, the patron saint of Birgu, and one of the main artworks to look out for is a painting by Mattia Preti, who was mentioned in the episode on art, if you remember, called the Martyrdom of St. Lawrence. The inside of the church is another one of those very splendid Baroque numbers, grand pillars, gold, ceiling paintings. Worth a look, I would say, at any time when you visit, but particularly so, as it happened, because this wasn't planned, on the weekend we went in April, because it happened to be their open weekend. So we were greeted by knights in costume, there were parades, the church was specially decorated, all their most precious relics were out on display, and in the little square just outside we came across a piece of street theatre, a reenactment of the bombing of the church in World War II, one of the worst atrocities that happened on the whole of Malta. I told the story in episode 4 on World War II, but just to recap briefly, 35 people had taken refuge in the crypt, but the church took a direct hit and they were all killed. There's a plaque on the wall just outside listing the names of everybody, and an inscription in Maltese and in English which reads, "To those who lost their lives to the enemy in the World War." If you chose to do all the things I've mentioned, I think you could easily spend a whole day in Birgu or Vittoriosa. So a bit of wandering, the Malta at War Museum, St. Lawrence's Church, and the Inquisitor's Palace. And here, just to finish this section, a little summary. Quote, "Walking through the streets of Vittoriosa is like stepping back in time, with its well-preserved medieval architecture and narrow winding alleys. The city's fortified walls, bastions, and impressive fortresses such as Fort St. Angelo stand as a testament to its defensive significance and the prowess of the Knights of St. John." A second idea then, also very easy to organise yourself, a visit to Mdina and Rabat. 30, maybe nearly 40 minutes bus ride from the bus station in Valletta. The area had Roman origins, there's something of that to see, and also an Arab past, and it was during the time that the Arabs lived there that it gained the names we use today. So the more built-up part was called Medina, which means town, and the little section just outside the walls became known as Rabat, which means suburbs. Before the knights arrived on Malta, it was in fact the seat of government, and when said knights decided to relocate and found Valletta, some of the aristocratic families in fact remained behind here in Medina. If you arrive by bus, you'll be able to see the main gate, so go through that, which takes you over a little bridge built over a moat. Another very impressive city entrance, again not dating right back to medieval times. This one was a replacement, built in 1724, Latin inscriptions over the top, and if, as you go through, you turn back to look at the archway, you will see 3 little niches built into it, each with a statue of a saint inside. There's St. Paul, the patron saint of Malta. There is Publius, the first bishop of Malta, appointed by St. Paul, and St. Agatha, who is the patron saint of Medina. And lots of other carvings and symbols too, things commissioned by various Grand Masters, for example. Medina is another place where you're going to want to wander. Narrow streets, pretty limestone houses with their coloured doors, the balconies, the wrought iron balustrades, lamps and flowers, various palazzi, various churches, a central square called Mesquita Square, cobblestones, fountains, restaurants. Really very atmospheric. I went in the daytime, but people did say if you do stay on into the evening, when many of these narrow little alleyways between the high walls of the houses are lit up, then perhaps you're seeing it at its very best. Again, particular things to look out for. I would suggest St. Paul's Cathedral. Again, not the original one. One was dismantled during the Muslim period, another was destroyed in an earthquake in 1693. This one then dates from 1702, although I think some of the artwork inside, for example the fresco of St. Paul's shipwreck, was rescued from earlier churches, and so predates the actual building that you're looking at, which is another Baroque splendour. More of those marble tombstones all over the floor. Things to look out for would include a statue of St. Publius and a tiny little statue of St. Paul, which you won't find unless you go looking for it, because it sits atop a great big pyramid near the entrance. And if you look up, you will see ceiling frescoes retelling the life of St. Paul. Attached to the cathedral is the Cathedral Museum, which has got a number of treasures in it. Some Albrecht Dürer woodcuts, for example, lots and lots of ecclesiastical things, robes and chalices and candles and whatnot. But the highlight, certainly for me anyway, was a collection of paintings from the early 15th century. I saw it labelled as a polyptych, which I think just means lots of paintings made into one artefact, so panels, each with a different picture on them. 10 pictures, in fact, all of St. Paul, retelling his life on Malta. Beautiful, bright colours, lots of gold highlights, showing him arriving by boat on the island, showing him preaching, healing, baptising others. It is stunning and prominently displayed, so you can't possibly miss it. A third place that you might want to visit is the Carmelite Priory, dating from the 17th century, one of those little courtyard buildings in which you could learn about the daily life of the friars. So see their refectory, for example, which is really beautifully decorated, to think marble and frescoes painted in pale pastel colours. So again, somewhere to wander and pop in and out of one or two places. Here's a summary of Mdina from one of the guidebooks I bought on the island. As you wander through the streets of Mdina, let yourself be transported to a world of knights, merchants and nobles. Discover the hidden gems tucked away within its walls, savour the captivating views and appreciate the sense of peace which envelops the silent city. If you go on a whole day visit, I would suggest you spend half of it in Mdina and the other half in nearby Rabat, so the part just outside the original city walls, where there are various other highlights to see. Most interesting, I think, of all, the Domus Romana, so Roman house, dating from about 50 AD. It lay hidden for centuries, was rediscovered, I think, in about 1880, and is now a little museum. So inside you can see fine mosaic floors. You'll come across life-size statues of, for example, the Emperor Claudius, and there's lots of information and bits and pieces to look at to tell the story of the Romans living here in Rabat. So items from daily life, cooking pots and drinking vessels and so on, and Roman sarcophagi. Secondly, I would suggest you visit the church and grotto of St. Paul. The church is in the main square. If you look round, you'll find, no surprise really, more artwork telling the story of St. Paul, and just near the entrance are steps down to St. Paul's Grotto, reputed to be the place where he took refuge during the 3 months he spent on Malta. It's small, dark and damp, but of great significance, particularly in the Catholic Church. In fact, on a fairly recent visit to Malta, Pope Benedict XVI himself visited the grotto to pray. Also not far away, St. Paul's Catacombs, a maze of burial chambers, 2 large halls, about 2,000 square metres in total, I think, and about 1,000 sarcophagi, and also an unusual feature known as agape tables, so round tables hewn from the rock itself, which it's thought were used during funerals, so somewhere for the mourners to assemble and sit together to eat one last meal with the deceased before that person was left buried down there. It's also thought that maybe people gathered on the anniversaries of the deaths of their loved ones too. Moving on then to other ideas for trips that you could take from Valletta, I'm going to focus on 2 categories of outing, both of which would come under the heading of by public transport, and those are bus excursions and boat trips. And bus-wise, there's a very useful hop-on, hop-off bus system. 2 different tours, one of the northern part of the island, effectively, and one of the southern part, where you can tour around, get off at a number of different stops, and make a day of it. They each take roughly 3 hours. The southern tour, for example, the earliest bus that leaves takes off about 9:30, and you're back just before 6, so it is most of the day. That one has 15 different stops. It's a round trip from Slima, just across the harbour from Valletta, and stops of greatest interest include the Hagarkim Temple, so one of the island's very famous Neolithic temples, this one dating from possibly as far back as 3,500 BC, a circular construction with 4 temples built of limestone. No burial remains have been found here, so it's thought that it was used for ceremonial purposes. And if you get off at that stop, just a 500-metre walk away, a second Neolithic temple complex, 3 temples this time, unpronounceable, possibly Mnadra, something like that, Mnajdra, where you will find secret chambers within temple walls where there are little niches believed to have been places where they kept their statues of gods and goddesses. Various finds which have turned up here have led people to believe that possibly it was used as a place of healing. Archaeologists have found clay models of human bones which show symptoms of disease. The thought is that maybe they were doing some kind of prayer ceremony here to heal people. Other stops then on the same tour, the Blue Grotto, a really deep sea cave where the water is, you've guessed it, deepest blue, and well known on the island as somewhere where people hid during the World War II air raids. A bit further round the coast from there, you've got the opportunity to stop at Marsaschlock, which is a picturesque fishing harbour, somewhere where you're going to see lots of those brightly coloured little boats, the Luzzu. Not just as tourist attractions, this is where Malta's largest fishing fleet is based, and a little wander there can be very picturesque. There's a market, there's a seafront promenade. On this trip you've got the option of stopping in Birgu, Vittoriosa as well, and at a third temple complex, the largest one on the island, in fact, the Tarshin complex, where archaeologists have found altars and animal bones, leading them to believe that it was also a place of sacrifice. The same company, I'll make sure the details are in the show notes, do a northern tour as well, another round trip from Slima, 23 stops this time. You surely won't have time to do all of them, but ones you might pick out would include a stop at Gezira village, from where you get really nice views back to Valletta, and from where in fact you could take a promenade walk back to St Julian's. Or if you carry on a bit, you'll arrive at a stop called the Tar Kali Crafts Village, where you can watch bobbin lace makers at work and people doing silversmithing, glass blowers, and where of course there's also no shortage of shopping opportunities, somewhere where you might decide to buy your souvenirs. Another stop, Mostar, where there is a church whose dome you can see from practically anywhere in the island, the Mostar Dome. The site of a miracle in World War II, say the islanders, because a Luftwaffe bomb landed right on the church, pierced the dome during Mass, but did not explode. You can get out at Mdina and Rabat on this trip too. You can also get out at St Paul's Bay, reputed to be the site where St Paul landed after the shipwreck which brought him to Malta, and where of course there is a church, St Paul's Church, believed to be on the site where he was first welcomed by Publius. Today it's a pretty little fishing village with a seaside promenade. More stops on the return to Slima would include 2 coastal stops, St George's Bay and Spinola Bay, the latter particularly being an attractive idea if you want to see a busy little fishing port and have a choice of restaurants with sea views. Boat trips, of course, are also a thing. I've already mentioned the trip to the 3 cities. An alternative option would be the 2 harbours cruise. There are several of those every day with English commentary. You'll go from Slima along the southern side of Valletta and round the tip of the peninsula, so past Fort St Elmo, and then up the northern side of the peninsula, so past the Grand Harbour, weaving in and out of various creeks, back past St Elmo again to Slima. About 2 hours in total, I think. A good trip if you want to set Valletta in context and get a sense of both its big harbours. Longer cruises will take you further afield, of course. I found an interesting 2-stop one where you go to the second biggest island, Gozo, with time to get a bus out to their capital, Victoria, see its city walls, its fortress, its Baroque cathedral, and then make your way back, but stopping on a second little island, Comino, where the activities are likely to be more in the range of swimming and sunbathing, etc. So a nice varied day out, giving you much more of a sense of the whole of Malta rather than the Valletta area. Lots of people, I imagine, do both. There are also, and again I'll put the links in the show notes, lots of options for speciality cruises, you might call them. So if you want to go snorkeling or on a fishing trip or perhaps cruise at sunset. You can't really ever forget that you're on an island when you're in Valletta because there are so many coastal views to both sides of the peninsula. And while there is plenty to do in Valletta itself, it is very nice to mix things up a bit and do some coastal exploring as well. So then that nicely rounds off the penultimate episode in this Valletta City Breaks series. The next and last episode is going to be called Stories from Valletta. Actually, I'm going to cheat a bit and include some Malta-based stories. It's going to be a little bit of a mix, So I'm going to start with some stories of people who have been referred to through the previous episodes, but whose stories deserve, I think, a little bit more time. So they would be St. Paul, Publius, Caravaggio, and Daphne Caruana Galizia. And then in the second half, some literary extracts, a mystery story, a couple of love stories, some World War II action, so that between them you will get, I hope, a more rounded picture of Malta and Valletta. Before I sign off, let me just remind you again about the blog post that will accompany this episode, a summary of what I've said, lots of links so that you can track down the places and the tours that I've referred to, and some of the photographs I took on the way round, all of which I hope will prove useful. So then, all that remains now is for me to thank you and say goodbye, both of which I can, I think, do in Maltese. So here goes. Grazie hufna. Saha.